Well, tonight we're going to look at Ruth chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, and every chapter in the book of Ruth is also an act in this story. So we're going to move from Act 1 to Act 2 tonight. And just kind of looking back at Act 1, it's called Death and Emptiness. This was Naomi's story. She experienced the death of her husband, her two sons. She felt empty, she felt bitter, she felt angry at God. And if the story ended with Act 1, this would be called a tragedy. As they put stories in different literary categories, this would be a definite tragedy that she experienced. It's also interesting that the crisis is in Act 1. And beginning in Act 2, we find the solution, the resolution. But it's going to take Act 2, 3, and 4 before the situation's finally resolved. And it's just a reminder that tragedy, crisis, difficulty can come out of nowhere. It can strike quickly, and we're in that situation. But the resolution to that could take weeks or months or even years. So Naomi's story is not going to be resolved overnight. It's going to be a process, and we go through that process as well. In fact, her life falls apart completely in just 5 verses. It's the journey from Bethlehem to Moab because of the famine. Her husband passes away. Her 2 sons marry Moabite women. 10 years later, they both die as well. And by the end of verse 5, Naomi has no husband, no sons, and 2 daughters-in-law who are foreigners to her because she's an Israelite and they're Moabites. Then in scene 2, it's the return from Moab to Bethlehem. Naomi hears that things are good in Bethlehem again, so she decides to go home. And the question is, will Ruth and Orpah go with her, or will they stay in Moab, since they are Moabites? And Naomi tries to convince them both that they should just stay. Life is better for you in Moab than Israel. So just go back to your father's family, find another husband, and live out your life in Moab. And Orpah says, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. That's what I'm going to do. So she stays in Moab. But Ruth clings to Naomi. She's not about to abandon her mother-in-law. In fact, she gives this incredible speech saying, I'm not going to abandon you. In fact, I'm going to be with you for the rest of your life. I'm even going to die in the same place that you die. And Naomi says, okay, I'm not going to convince you, otherwise you're coming with me. And she does. Then in verses 19 through 22 is scene 3, and it's Naomi's lament. She finally gets back home with her friends, and she just lets loose. She just tells her story in such a way that her life has completely fallen apart. She says to her friends, don't call me Naomi, because that means pleasant. Call me Mara, because that means bitter. And that's who I am. I'm now a bitter old woman who is angry and frustrated with God. She never admits to doing anything wrong. She never says her husband did something wrong, her sons did anything wrong. No, this was misfortune that came to her, and God allowed it, and she's not happy with it. But at the same time, she's not about to give up God, so she has to wrestle with it. She has to deal with it. God let this happen, and I still need to follow God. And that's kind of where we find ourselves when difficulty comes in our lives. Many people who don't have faith in God walk away from Him and want nothing to do with God for the rest of their lives. But as believers in Christ, we know that's not the way to go. Instead, we have to live with what God allowed, and we have to wrestle in our relationship with Him. And that's where we leave Naomi at the end of chapter 1. She's depressed. In fact, today we would call her clinically depressed. She's bitter. She's angry. She's frustrated. Life has given her a bad deal, and she's basically hits rock bottom at the end of chapter 1. Well, as we move on to Act 2, it's the search for short-term security. We have 2 widows. one older, Naomi, one younger, Ruth. How are they going to survive in the ancient world? Because for a woman in the ancient world, you survived because of what your husband did for you or what your sons did for you. And they don't have a husband. They don't have any sons. So how will they survive in the ancient world? And they have to come up with a plan in order to do that. Now, in Act 1, it was all about Naomi. In Act 2, the spotlight's going to shift, and we're going to talk about Ruth. Ruth becomes the main character in both chapter 2 and chapter 3. We'll get back to Naomi in chapter 4. But it's Naomi's crisis. And as the story unfolds, we're looking for a solution for Naomi. That she can no longer have to live as a bitter woman who's depressed, who's angry at God, frustrated at life. Somehow that has to be resolved. And Ruth is going to play a part in resolving that issue. It's also interesting that for the most part, what we read in chapter 2 happens in one day. It starts in the morning, kind of concludes in the evening, and then it tells us that this day went on similarly for several more months. But it's basically one day, the events that happen in that day. Now, there are 3 scenes in Act 2, just like there were 3 scenes in Act 1. And if you can't see these up on the screen, they're in your notes. The first scene, the main characters are Naomi and Ruth. The location is Naomi's house. And the main action is that Ruth comes up with a plan. She has a plan for their survival. Then scene 2 is in chapter 2, verses 4 through 17. This is the longest scene. And the characters are Ruth and Boaz and the workers, the harvesters that are working for Boaz. The location changes. We're now out in a field, a farm that's owned by Boaz. And the main action is an encounter between Ruth and Boaz. They will meet for the first time. Then scene 3, verses 18 through 23, the main characters again are Naomi and Ruth. They're back in Naomi's home, and it's kind of a debrief. Ruth comes home, and Naomi says, "How did it go?" And Ruth is going to tell her how it went, and that's going to help them formulate an even more extensive plan for their survival. Well, tonight we're going to look at scene 1, which is the plan of Ruth. The scene begins with the introduction of a new character. And the good news for the women is it's a man. Now, today that may not matter, but in the ancient world, that mattered a lot. There's a man who's going to be introduced who just might be willing to help. He can do some things for them that they can't do for themselves. Basically, they're on their own and they're pretty much destitute, but if there's a man in their life, he might be able to help them. Well, let me go back to chapter 1, verse 22. This is the last verse in chapter 1. And in many ways, it's a transitional verse. It will conclude Act 1, and it sets up Act 2. So, Naomi returns from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite. And it's interesting that the author keeps reminding us that Ruth is a Moabite. We already know that, but he wants to tell us that again and again and again. It's her daughter-in-law, and they arrive in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Chapter 1 is extremely depressing. I mean, especially for Naomi, she had to live it. But even for the reader, why do I want to read this? This is depressing. And finally, at the very end of Act 1, there's this note of hope. The barley harvest is going to begin. Chapter 1 begins with a famine, and it ends with a harvest. There's hope. Not much, but just a little. But at least it's not totally depressing. There is a little hope. And then chapter 2, verse 1, starts out with this information from the narrator. Kind of the story kind of stops, and the narrator's going to give us some information about a new character, a man. And there's more hope because a man is about to enter the story. And we're told 4 things about this man. And the first one is Naomi had a relative on her husband's side. So whoever this man is, he's a relative of Elimelech, which was Naomi's husband. Now, the problem is Naomi's only connected to him through her husband. And the problem is her husband is no longer alive, and she has no children, no sons. Now, back in the ancient world, there were these clans, and we'll get to the clans here in a moment, and they followed the line of the male. So if you married someone, if you were a woman and you married a man, you became part of his clan as soon as you gave birth to a son, because you've now given birth to the heir. And so now you're accepted into the clan. But if your husband dies and your sons die, you have no more connection to the clan. In other words, no one else in the clan is a blood relative, and basically you kind of entered as an outsider. Your husband died, your sons died. You're pretty much out of the clan at that point. So the author does tell us there's this ray of hope. This is a relative of Elimelech, but at this point, Naomi's no longer connected with the clan because she has no husband and no sons. In fact, for a woman with no husband and no sons, she normally goes back to her father's family because it's her father's family that has the males, and they progress generation through generation. So it would be better for Naomi if someone from her father's family was connected in such a way that he could help her. But this is from Elimelech's family. Well, the second thing that we're told is that he is a man of standing. And the NIV translates a Hebrew phrase where you can be a man of standing in 4 different ways. Sometimes it's used for those who are involved in the military. You're a mighty warrior. You're a man of standing. It can also be used of someone who has material wealth. You're a man of wealth, so you're a man of standing. The third way in which it's used is you're a man of morals. You're a man of integrity. So you're a man of standing because of your great moral integrity. Or the fourth way is socially. You're a man of great influence, which means you're a man of standing. Now, as it turns out, Boaz meets 3 of those 4 qualifications. There's no indication that he's a mighty warrior. In fact, we're going to find out he's a landowner, but he's wealthy, and he's a man of integrity. And by the end of the book, we find out he also has a lot of influence in what takes place in Bethlehem. So this is a man of standing, which means maybe he can do something for Naomi to help her. Also, he's from the clan of Elimelech. And it's interesting that in the ancient world, you were defined by 4 different relationships. One was the nation or the country that you were a part of. And obviously, this individual is an Israelite. Then there's the tribe. He's from the tribe of Judah, which happens to be Elimelech's tribe. He's also from the clan of Elimelech, and both of them were most likely Ephrathites, which was mentioned back in chapter 1, verse 2. So that's the clan that they were from. And by the way, just to get to the end of the story, King David's from that clan as well, just to let you know. And then finally, you're defined by your father. And at the end of the story, we do find out the name of Boaz's father. Well, the fourth characteristic, and it's interesting, this man is described before we even know his name. But finally, the author tells us his name. His name is Boaz. And we really don't know the origin of the name or what the name means, but some of the similar sounding Hebrew words mean in him is strength. So Boaz perhaps is a man of great strength. So it's interesting that the author introduces us to this character, and at the moment we have no idea why. I mean, other than the fact he's connected to Naomi through Elimelech, but other than that, we don't know what part he's going to play in the story, at least not yet. Well, we move on to verse 2, and Naomi, depressed as she is still kind of the leader of her family. And so Ruth has an idea, but instead of just going forward with her idea, she has to check with Naomi first. So Ruth has this idea that she wants to go to the fields and glean. And I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. In other words, I'm going to find some grain. I'm going to bring it back home, and we can use it to make food so we can eat. Again, Ruth is realizing that we have no man to take care of us. So somebody has to do something. So Ruth takes the initiative and says, Naomi, I got an idea. Why don't I go out to the fields and glean, and I'll bring back some food, and we can cook it, and we can survive. So that is her plan. What we don't know is, why didn't Naomi take the initiative? I mean, Bethlehem is her town. She knows a lot of people who live there. Ruth knows nobody other than Naomi. And it's interesting that Naomi doesn't say to Ruth, I've got an idea. You're young. Why don't you go out to these fields and glean and get us some food? And not only that, I'm going to go with you. And since I know most of the people, I'll find somebody who owns one of these fields, who likes me, that I'm a friend of, and he'll let you glean in his field. So I'll kind of clear the way for you so that you can go glean and grab some grain, bring it home, and we can survive. Naomi doesn't do any of that. Now, Ruth did make a promise to Naomi that I'm going to be with you the rest of your life, and I'm going to help take care of you. And she's keeping her promise. She wants to go out and glean and gather some food so they can both survive. And once again, our wonderful narrator identifies Ruth as the Moabite. And yes, we already know that, and we've heard that many times now, but it kind of creates some suspense in the story. Here's this young woman. She's going to go out into an Israelite field, and she's going to try to glean. How will that be received by whoever owns the field? Will they look at her and say, you're a Moabite, no Moabites allowed? And will they send her away? So it creates a bit of suspense. Now, the writer does on occasion simply call her Ruth. So the fact that he includes the fact again that she's a Moabite means it could be important for this story. And again, Bethlehem is a small town. How will the people in this small town respond to a foreigner, a Moabite? Now, they know Naomi, and it appears that they really love Naomi, but how will they respond to her daughter-in-law? Will she be able to find favor in a foreign field and be able to support herself and her mother-in-law? Well, Ruth's going to go to glean. And if we jump back to chapter 1, we have an Israelite family led by Elimelech, who because of a famine goes to Moab and finds food. The question in chapter 2 is, can a Moabite leave the land of Moab, go to the land of Israel, to the town of Bethlehem, and find food? That becomes the big question here. Now, the land was subdivided into various fields, and basically it was plotted according to who owned the field. So chances are your field, if you owned a field, would bump up against another field that was owned by someone else. So the good news for Ruth is that the Jewish people, the Israelites, have a law about how to support people who can't support themselves. And there's a provision for the needy that includes foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows. And Ruth happens to fit into two of those categories. She's a foreigner. She's also a widow. And she would then be allowed to do something that's called glean, which means you follow in behind the harvesters. And whatever they drop and whatever they miss is fair game for you. So according to the book of Deuteronomy, whatever the harvesters don't take, the gleaners can help themselves to. Also, according to Leviticus, the landowners are not to harvest the edges of their farm. They're to leave the edges for the fatherless, the foreigners, and the widows. So there would be an opportunity for Ruth to gather the grain. Now, this is an interesting way in the ancient world for people who can't support themselves to find food. Back then, there were no food pantries where you drive up and they give you food. Back then, there was an opportunity, though, to find food, but in essence, you had to work for it. You know, Ruth can't go up and say, "Oh, landowner, I happen to be a foreigner and a widow. Hand me some food." It doesn't work that way. But she can go and gather the food. Gleaning, which means if the harvesters take most of it or almost all of it, it could take several hours to find enough grain that it would be sufficient to meet your needs. So this could end up being some hard work that she has to do in order to find enough grain for herself and for Naomi. But it was an interesting way in the ancient world to make sure that everybody gets to eat. The farmers were instructed that these gleaners could come in and they could take the leftovers. Now, Ruth wants to take the leftovers from someone in whose eyes I find favor. Ruth may have known that even though the law says I'm allowed to go and glean, the landowner may have his own law, meaning he may not let just anybody come on his property and glean in his field. In fact, for the Israelites, they were not very open to foreigners to begin with, so there's a good possibility she could get turned down. She could go to glean and then, no, we don't allow anybody here but Israelites. And if you're not an Israelite, you're not welcome here. Especially in a small town, that was a possibility. So she wants to find favor in someone's eyes who would let her glean. And it could be that gleaning was simply part of the ancient Near East. In other words, there were gleaners in Moab as well. So Ruth probably knew about this. You know, we have laws too that people who are poor, who can't support themselves, can come in and glean so that they could find enough food. So she wants to find food, and she's at the mercy of whoever owns the land. Well, Naomi hears the idea, and she says, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she agrees. And she calls Ruth her daughter, which in the ancient world, if you were much older than someone, you may call someone not related to you your daughter or your son, just as a recognition that you're much older than they are. But at the same time, Naomi has called Ruth her daughter back in chapter 1. And Naomi cares about Ruth. In fact, she would argue, I cared so much about Ruth, I tried to talk her into staying in Moab, where life would be better for her. But I still care for her, and I still look upon her as my daughter. So there's an intimate relationship there. There's love and caring that's taking place. Interesting question in the ancient world. How were senior citizens taken care of? People who could no longer work and take care of themselves, who was supposed to take care of them? Well, according to the laws of the Israelites, the son was supposed to take care of his parents, especially the oldest son. When it says honor your father and mother, it was really not originally written for little kids to make sure they talk to their parents in a respectful way. It was really written for adult children to make sure they took care of their senior parents. So when your parents get old and can't take care of themselves, sons especially, you are supposed to take care of your parents. It's your responsibility. Now, if there are no sons, then it falls to the daughters to take care of their parents. But there's no law in the land of Israel that says a daughter-in-law has to take care of her mother-in-law. So what Ruth is willing to do for Naomi is above and beyond what the law requires. She's acting as if she's a biological child, even though she's neither son nor daughter. So she's willing to do this for Naomi. It's also interesting that Naomi says, go ahead, my daughter. And we're not told what else she may have told her. In many ways, it was dangerous for a woman to go into the fields where the men are and glean. There were dangers involved in that. In fact, we'll get to those in the next section. So she doesn't warn her of potential dangers. She doesn't even wish her well. And again, she doesn't volunteer to go with her to try to set her up for success. She doesn't say, you know what, Ruth, I know one of the landowners. Let me take you there, introduce you to him, and he'll let you glean, and he'll look after you as well. Make sure nothing bad happens to you. She doesn't do any of that. She just says, go ahead. And that's it. Well, Ruth, that's all she needed was the go ahead. And in 3 verbs, the writer describes what Ruth does. She goes out, leaves Naomi's house, she enters a field, and she begins to glean behind the harvesters. So she finds a field, and she begins to glean. The field, well, chances are that was a cultivated area on the outskirts of town. So everybody lived in the town, and all the fields were on the outskirts. So you had to leave the town, go out to the outskirts, and find the field in order to glean. And that's what she does. Again, these are not marked by hedges or walls. Probably boundary stones is what they're marked by. A very simple thing in the ancient world, especially in a small town. But the author wants to tell us where she gleans, the location. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. You know, that guy I introduced you to in verse 1, that's where Ruth ends up. She ends up in his field. And it's interesting how the author does this. The NIV translates it as it turned out. Literally, it means by chance she chanced upon. Now, again, Ruth doesn't know anybody in Bethlehem. So Naomi's given her permission to go out to the fields and start gleaning. So she picks one at random. Maybe she picks the first one she comes to. Maybe she picks one that's closest to her or one that looks nice to her. She just picks one. And it just so happens she picks the field that belongs to Boaz. And the author presents this as chance, random, luck. Now, luck was rather prevalent in several ancient cultures. In fact, luck is fairly prevalent in our culture. I just happened to be looking through, these job listings, and by luck, I happened to find one and they hired me. Or, I just so happened to have driven by this house and I looked at it and it was the perfect house. I got lucky that I found the house of my dreams and I just happened to drive by it. I guess I got lucky. When people today, they're going to go out and do something, we often say, well, I wish you luck. But luck was really not part of the Israeli culture. The Israelis recognized that God was in control, and God was in charge of everything. So ultimately, God is behind all the events that take place. And so Ruth's unintentional choice was actually God's choice for her. God was working behind the scenes, even though Ruth probably didn't have a clue. She just said, I kind of like that field, and away she goes. But that's the field that God wanted her to choose. And it's a reminder that accidental events are directed by God. You didn't just happen to go there. God led you there. You didn't accidentally find the house. That was the one God had for you. You didn't accidentally meet your spouse. God directed you to do that. God is behind all of these things. And faith enables us to turn luck into a blessing, to turn coincidence into providence. It's not accidental. God did it. Now, as a good author, sometimes it's best not to tell the audience what to think, but to let them figure it out on their own. And a good storyteller will often do that. The author could have told us that, God directed this whole thing, but he doesn't want to tell us that. He wants us to come to that conclusion. So it's almost at this point that the writer is screaming at the reader, pay attention. God sent the famine. It was God who enabled Naomi to learn that there was food again in Bethlehem. And God brought Naomi and Ruth back to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest on purpose. And it was God who directed Ruth to go glean in the field of Boaz. It's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. It's God. But it takes great spiritual insight to see the hand of God in your life when you're going through your own story. Sometimes you can see it better in somebody else's life than even in your own. And a great example of that, of course, is the Old Testament character Joseph. After he gets reunited with his brothers, he says to them, hey guys, what you tried to do to me, that was evil. But God used your evil for good to save many lives, including yours and mine. Joseph said, if you would not have sold me into slavery, and if I would not have ended up in Egypt, we may have all starved to death. But because God did that, even though it was evil on your part, God saved all of our lives. And Joseph was mature enough to see the hand of God in his life. And the question, do we see that? Do we see what happens to us not as coincidence, not as luck, not as good fortune or even bad fortune, but God is directing our life. God is in control, and we need to follow him by faith. Well, that brings us to the conclusion of scene 1. And now we move to scene 2, which ultimately will be the encounter between Ruth and Boaz. So these two individuals are going to meet. The landowner and the gleaner are going to meet. Ruth the Moabite and Boaz the honorable are going to meet each other. But in this particular scene, there are 3 conversations, and I've actually got them listed in your notes. The first one is Boaz's conversation with his workers, and that's in verses 4 through 7. Then Boaz will have a conversation with Ruth in verses 8 through 14. And then finally, Boaz will have another conversation with his workers in verses 15 through 17. So this entire scene is about dialogue. And Boaz does most of the talking, including his conversation with his workers, which begins in verse 4. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem. Well, he lived in Bethlehem. His field was on the outskirts, so he travels from Bethlehem to his farm. And we get the impression that Boaz is not there every day, that he's basically turned this operation over to a supervisor. The supervisor could be a slave that he owns. It could be somebody that he's hired to supervise the other workers, because it's harvest time. I mean, this is huge, because if he's got a big farm, he can make a lot of money. He'll have enough for his family. He can sell it to others. He can do really well during harvest time. But on this particular day, he happens to show up. And again, the author's kind of teasing us. It's God who made sure he showed up. But it just so happens on this day he shows up. Just then, Boaz arrived. And the first words out of his mouth are a greeting to his workers, to the harvesters. And he says, "The Lord be with you." And again, the Lord is in all capital letters, so it's Yahweh. So he says, "Yahweh be with you." And then the workers respond by saying, "The Lord, Yahweh, bless you." So we find out that Boaz is a spiritual man. He recognizes that God, Yahweh, is the Lord of the harvest. And God has blessed him with this harvest. So he's telling his workers to give God praise for this wonderful harvest that they've been blessed with. We also find that the workers seem to respect him. He is the landowner. He owns the property, but he has a cordial relationship with those who are working for him. And again, we get the understanding that he's a man of standing. He's a man of wealth. He's a man of integrity. He's a man of spiritual values. So what we learn about Boaz in this first verse is that he's a pretty good guy. And he addresses his workers. Then he has a question for the overseer. The overseer is the supervisor, the guy he's put in charge, the individual who's responsible for the harvest, for the workers, the one who's his eyes and ears when he's not there. So he's checking up on everybody today, but basically he's turned things over to a supervisor. And Boaz looks around and says, "Wow, there's somebody new in my field today. Somebody I've never seen before. And it just so happens to be a woman, a young woman." And so he's going to ask the supervisor, who does that young woman belong to? Now, we read that question and we go, what kind of question is that? I mean, if we were to ask the question today, we would say, who is that young woman? Or what is that young woman's name? But he doesn't ask that question. He doesn't even ask what her name is. He wants to know who she belongs to. And again, we are dealing with the ancient world. And Boaz doesn't necessarily need to know who she is, but who she belongs to, who she identified with. So he doesn't need to know her name. He really wants to know her owner, the one responsible for her. Because in the ancient world, she could be a slave, which means she's owned by somebody. Whose slave is that? Or it could be a wife, and, whose husband, who's the husband of this woman? Or it could be that she's not married, and who's the father of this woman? Back in the ancient world, a person's identity was primarily who they're related to and to what groups they belong. And he would like to know this about this young woman. Because in the ancient world, if she's not married, she belongs to her father. And if her father has passed away, she belongs to her uncle. In other words, there's a man looking out for her. And if she is married, well, she belongs to her husband. So, ladies, you should just be so blessed that you did not live in the ancient world, because if you were a woman in the ancient world, the day you were born, you belonged to your father. And the day you got married, you belonged to your husband. There wasn't much independence there. So he wants to know, who does she belong to? And beginning next week, we'll get you the answer to that question, because the answer's in verse 6, and we're stopping there in verse 5. But as this story unfolds, we can see God putting this story together. The author wants us to come to that conclusion. Because ultimately, Naomi's given God a challenge. Because she blamed God for all of her misfortune. So, God, can you fix this? God, is there an answer to this? And God knows that there is. But it's going to unfold step by step, which is a reminder to us that God is working in our lives even when we can't see it. God's got a plan, even though we don't know what it is. And as the readers, read this story, we get to see it unfold. And as you live it, you get to see it unfold. You get to see what God's really up to in your life and what He wants to do. But it's going to unfold scene by scene. And often we get frustrated when it doesn't all come together at once. Because remember, the problem is in Act 1. It happens really quickly. It happens in 5 verses. But the solution will take Act 2, Act 3, and Act 4. So remember that in your own life as well. It's not that you have a problem today and God's going to show up tomorrow with the solution. He may not show up till next month or next year or 5 years from now. And you have to stay in faith and believe all that time. And that's the tough part. But when you get there, you can be like Joseph and say, oh, I got it. I've got it. I can see it now. What you tried to do to me, that was really bad. But God used your bad for something good, and I can see it now. May all of us have one of those moments where we say, I got it. I can see it now. But it's going to unfold in Act 2, Act 3. And Act 4. Well, Heavenly Father, thank you for this story. And thank you for working in our lives. Even when we don't recognize you, even when we didn't even pray, we didn't even ask you to do something, you're still doing it. You're still working out our story, chapter by chapter, scene by scene. And Father, I pray that we can begin to see what you're doing, what you're up to. May our faith grow as we begin to recognize your hand in our life as well. So, Father, I pray your blessings upon all of us. And no matter what we're going through, you've got a plan, you've got a purpose. We need to trust you. And may our faith grow in you every single day, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.